Hello and welcome to Niaga Spotlight with me, Tamina Kauschi. Niaga Spotlight takes us through the week in economic analysis and future affairs. Now this week on Future Affairs, we discuss US tariffs versus ASEAN centrality. Hold on to your wallets, folks, because the past 2 weeks have been nothing short of a financial roller coaster. It all began, of course, with President Donald Trump's Liberation Day moves on April the 2nd, slapping hefty tariffs on a slew of trading partners. China felt the brunt with a staggering 125% tariff, while Canada, Mexico and the EU were hit with 25%. The global economy collectively gasped for air, markets plunged, investors panicked, and the bond market, let's just say it wasn't winning any popularity contests. Now, according to Bloomberg, 3 days of market losses, Thursday, Friday and Monday, decimated $10 trillion of global equity value. I repeat, $10 trillion. Now, that represents roughly 10% of global gross domestic product and more than the combined GDP of 150 countries. This has been the biggest disruption to global trade in decades. But true to form, just a week later, President Trump announced a 90-day suspension of these tariffs, with China remaining the glaring exception. This sudden U-turn sent markets soaring, and notably the world's 10 richest billionaires added $135 billion in wealth after Trump's tariff pause, with Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg seeing the biggest surge. Now, let's zoom in on our own backyard, Southeast Asia. ASEAN has found itself in a delicate dance, trying to maintain its centrality amidst this US-China trade tango. Caught between the economic behemoths, ASEAN's role in regional value chains is now more crucial than ever. Malaysia, wearing the ASEAN chair hat this year, has been vocal about this balancing act. Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim emphasized the importance of strengthening regional value chains and regulatory cooperation. He pointed out that expanding trade and investment linkages, along with fostering digital transformation, are key to navigating these choppy geopolitical waters. But it's not just about economics, it's about strategy. Prime Minister Anwar warned against ASEAN's divisions being exploited amid rising global tensions. He stressed that the bloc must remain united and neutral, resisting any attempts to draw lines in the sand. So what's Malaysia's game plan? Instead of waiting for the US to make the next tariff move, Malaysia is proactively building trade relations with countries like China, Russia and Brazil. This approach aims to diversify partnerships and reduce over-reliance on any single nation. In essence, ASEAN's centrality is being tested like never before. Caught between the economic ambitions of the US and China, the region must leverage its collective strengths to maintain stability and growth. Malaysia's leadership and strategic decisions will play a pivotal role in shaping ASEAN's trajectory in these turbulent times. Professor Dr Pavida Pananond, Professor of International Business at Thammasat Business School, Thammasat University, Thailand, joins me now online to discuss US tariffs versus ASEAN centrality. A very good morning, Prof. How are you doing? Thank you so much for making time for Niaga Spotlight.
Good morning, Tamina, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me on your show.
Fantastic. Prof, let's get the ball rolling. And I'd love to pitch this first question to you, asking about how might these recent US trade tariffs, which were announced on Liberation Day, there's been a bit of a rollback, of course, then affect ASEAN supply chains, particularly looking at the important sectors, electronics, textiles, semiconductors.
As you can see, it's not something that is very easy to estimate right now because things can change. But we can probably see that supply chain in Southeast Asia and throughout the world would be heavily affected by this. Because when you look at supply chain, it's not just the connection of final products, but it is also the intermediate products that are connected through value chains and supply chains of many industries. So when tariffs are imposed on all the goods and merchandise that enter the US, of course, it would increase the price of final products to consumers, but at the same time, it would also increase the price for producers in the US. So obviously, they would have to think twice about how they manage their supply chain. And mind you that this is only one part of the tariff. There are also some sectors, such as automotive, that are also subjected to additional tariff or separate set of tariff as well. So you can see that the ramification on suppliers and supply chain will be very strong for a region that is like a big hub of manufacturing like us in Southeast Asia.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Prof. I think that's an excellent way to get started off with the discussion. But of course, then now focusing on another factor, which is that there's a huge growing trend of regional integration and intra-ASEAN trade dependencies. Some thoughts on that and where that pitches us all given these turbulent and interesting times over the past few weeks?
I think it's good that we have been seeing the increase in intra-ASEAN trade. But if you look at the intra-ASEAN trade, it's still right now at about perhaps 20 to 21%. And that means that ASEAN still needs to trade with others. And the major markets for ASEAN combined, mainly we cannot avoid having the US and China as our two largest trading partners. And then the EU and Japan are also our big trading partner and export destination. So although it is a good sign that the intra-ASEAN trade is growing, meaning that we can also try to strengthen the intra-regional trade to help diversify the risk from dependency on the US market alone. But the US market alone, only one single country, also account for approximately 20% of the ASEAN export destination as well. So that is something to take into consideration that ASEAN, all 10 countries together is 20%, but when the US alone accounts for 20%, we cannot simply turn away from the US, and certainly the impact will be on the negative side if the US become protectionist against everyone, including us. That still depends a lot on the US market.
Absolutely. Great food for thought, because considering the fact that it was actually ASEAN nations amongst them were also part of the countries that the 90-day suspension has been announced towards. So that is actually quite positive in that light. Let's also perhaps delve a little, Prof Pavida, on the fact that recent shifts in global supply chains, particularly post-pandemic, they also helped us to realign and deepen regional economic cooperation. So what do you think the balance between resilience and efficiency in ASEAN supply chains and some of the lessons which we learned from the post-pandemic time all the way up till 2025 today that maybe actually prove to be more helpful than we even know?
Very good question to address on the issue of resilience. When we talk about resilience, especially this day, we tend to be thinking of resilience in terms of the country interests. But you have to keep in mind that resilience have the three levels. First is the resilience for the firm, for the company that is involved in that particular business. And second, resilience is for the industry as a whole. And then third level is the resilience for country. For example, if we are looking at resilience in the automotive industry, resilience at the firms mean that they are very efficient. They can produce to the scale that they need to be at the cost that it is efficient. Resilience at the industry scale, meaning that you can be located in the country that is most efficient for the industry and for the companies that are operating that supply chain. For example, Indonesia might now be interesting because they have rare mineral earth, but Thailand is also interesting because it has the assembly hub. And then you add the resilience at the country level, where we are talking about how country needs to build resilience by being self-sufficient. So when we look at this, you can see that from the pre-pandemic, where supply chain was left to be driven more by efficiency. Everybody decide what is best for them and then locate the investment where it best suits them. But now resilience is being very much driven by security interests of countries. So that's why the resilience equation does not always fit between the interests of the country and the interests of firms. As you can see that the car companies in the US are not very happy with President Trump's call for tariff. So when that happens, what companies have to do is they have to think, how do they make sure that their supply chain is prepared for this sort of risk. And one thing that we can see for sure is everybody after COVID is more interested in having a shorter supply chain, because we can see how longer supply chain can pose risk. So with that, ASEAN stands at a good chance because we are already a kind of a manufacturing hub between us. And we also have a growing market because many emerging markets are expanding with the middle class. So that is the positive aspect for ASEAN. But at the same time, we have to be aware that ASEAN are competing against each other after similar industries. You know, Malaysia wants to attract investment in semiconductor. Singapore is also doing that, and Thailand also wants to get into that. So there is also a competing elements in there that would make our attempt to come up with a kind of ASEAN plan or strategy not that easy to follow. But at the same time, it is necessary to make sure that ASEAN can present itself better as a cohesive regional that would allow a better setup of a regional value chain.
Absolutely. Regional value chains will be the central part of it, because especially given that the status quo has shifted, for example, large multinationals like Nike, etc., who had quite quickly shifted production to Vietnam, for example. What happens then if the tariffs 90 days from now do come into place and Vietnam suffers the close to almost 50% tariffs? Lots to ponder on, but moving along swiftly again, Prof Pavida, let's look at the potential for a global recession looming, with also American business leaders already stating that the domestic economy in America is facing a significant downturn. May there be any specific data or even indications suggesting that the new US tariffs might exacerbate economic slowdowns in ASEAN countries? And what can our key industries in the region do to shore themselves up just in time?
I think the indicator for recession has already been indicated in each individual country by the central bank or by the World Bank report and all that. And in general, it seems to suggest that with the level of recession that the world could face, each country might be looking at least 1 to 2% reduction in their GDP growth for the next year. So that is quite concerning. And if you look at ASEAN country as a whole, we are also dependent not just on the US market, but on the global, because most of the ASEAN countries are very export driven. So take Thailand, for example. If you look at what is happening, we would be hit by 36% of tariff, and that would reduce and impact our export to the US. But when the recession in the US affect the rest of the world, that would also affect the demand from the rest of the world. So that means that other market might also be facing some slowdown in the market. So that also add to the negative factor of our export potential. And then Thailand is also dependent on tourism. And when people and households face this kind of increasing costs for their lifestyle, because consumption would cost more, they cut on unnecessary spending, and tourism is one thing. So that would also have a spillover into how people spend on service sector and tourism. So many countries in ASEAN are similar to Thailand in the sense that they depend on exports to the world, and they also depend on tourism. So I think that would be quite a risky factor to see how bad it would impact. And I think the country that depend more on export would likely to suffer more. You can see that two countries that perhaps would be a little more less concerned than others are, for example, Singapore or the Philippines, which depends a lot more on the export of service, not export on merchandise goods. So I think now ASEAN would have to rethink their economic policy. Should they be very dependent simply on export of merchandise, or how they should diversify their economy? That's one thing. And for companies involved, I think now they would have to be looking at their supply chain, how they can see more of where they source different products from, because the tariff increase that is not the same for all countries also increase complexity for companies and multinationals that have to buy from many countries. Imagine you buy from in the automotive industry, you have one set of tariff on the automotive sector, and at the same time, you also have to look at where your parts come from different countries. So that would make the supply chain cost a lot more complex and a lot more, how should I say, entangled between different set of tariffs that President Trump has put upon the world.
Indeed. Now, for example, I appreciate the sectoral examples because Malaysia is also one that could be subject to those, given that, for example, the glove industry relies quite heavily on imports from China. Given the tariff landscape, that could, of course, then impact how Malaysia's productivity and also profitability is impacted in this arena. Once again, moving on, Prof. Pavida. Now, considering ASEAN's reliance on both the Chinese as well as the American markets, how might the tariffs lead to perhaps a reconfiguration of trade flows in the region? And what opportunities might this create for ASEAN countries to diversify or even reshape our manufacturing hubs, perhaps not just in light of these Liberation Day tariffs, but just moving forward to 2030 and even beyond?
I think now it is an important lesson for ASEAN now that we have to diversify our market, and getting too close to China has its own risks because we are already very close to China. We import, a lot. ASEAN as a whole, I think, import from China more than we import from the US. And that could also be a risk if we move too close to China, because you don't know if the US would also impose some kind of tariff on countries that import from China as well. That's one scenario. But closer to China in the sense of opening more to Chinese product would also bring its own risk, because China produce a lot of items that are being produced locally in Southeast Asia. So if we move too close by becoming more dependent on China, that would also invite more of the Chinese product that could come into Southeast Asia. So I think the lesson learned is to diversify away from major market and try to make sure that we are not too dependent on one over the other. And but that simply is not that easy, because our trade structure has been very much driven by two countries, particularly China. So it is important, I think, more than ever, as you said earlier, that ASEAN centrality and how ASEAN should be looking for trying to make sure that the trade among ourselves and investment flow could be improved. Although we cannot ignore the fact that we, at the same time, are also competing for similar markets and also competing for similar flows of foreign direct investment.
True indeed, and perhaps to minimize replication of especially sectoral items and imports into ASEAN nations, we could even perhaps strengthen initiatives such as the ASEAN Free Trade Area AFTA that has led to an almost 22% increase in markets in recent times. But what could be some strategies to ensure that this becomes operationalized in the near future rather than wait for another bigger crisis, so to speak, financial markets wise?
I think we also have the mechanism that is in place. For example, AFTA, as you said, and that is now moved to ASEAN Economic AEC. So, if we make sure that we really make sure that those things work in terms of facilitating flows between trade and investment, removing barriers that could be coming from non-tariff barriers, regulatory barriers. And I think right now, we should not be seeking new mechanism, but making sure that the mechanism that we have can operate as best as they possibly can. And that should already help increase the ease of doing business inside the region better.
Operationalizing indeed. And looking at FDIs, Prof Pavida, what long-term effects might the US tariffs have on ASEAN countries' abilities to attract FDI, and could they actually accelerate the trend of reshoring or nearshoring in the US and Europe? We're particularly talking about sectors, automotive, high-tech manufacturing, which are very key in this day and age.
I think that's a very good question, because one strong impact of the US tariff is it tries to promote reshoring inside the US. And that would be something that ASEAN countries should be concerned, because at first, when only China got this tariff treatment, most ASEAN countries were looking forward to becoming the China plus one factory and manufacturing hub. But now that everybody gets this kind of the treatment of a higher tariff, the strategy of becoming the China plus one is less attractive to foreign companies that are thinking about their location. So now I think that most countries would have to think of what else that they can think of to be of values to foreign investors when they look for locations for their destination. And I think right now, multinational companies would also be asking the question of why they are where they are. And that means that not just the countries, but the suppliers in each supply chain would have to think about how they can do to become indispensable in that sort of the era of supply chain where consolidation might be a strategy, and relocation and reshoring to the US, or reshoring and nearshoring to the market that is nearer, is becoming alternative. It used to be that we are the efficient location because of cost structure and cheaper costs, but that is no longer the case when the tariff increased the cost to the extent that we see today.
Clearly, and also with the US actually contributing in excess of 40.2 billion in FDI to ASEAN in 2021. This was also a huge jump of almost 41% from the previous year. It speaks of the future 5 to 10 year picture, perhaps. There's also been talk that Apple, for example, is going to move iPhone production to India, hopefully moving 25% of that into India, clearly divesting out of China, which produces almost close to 50% of Apple's products today. So moving on from there into talking about US trade policy, Prof Pavida, how might the introduction of these tariffs signal a new phase perhaps in American trade policy, where economic tools like tariffs are being wielded not only to adjust market outcomes, but also to influence global governance structures, as is starting to become more apparent?
As we can see, if we look at the global governance structure of international trade in terms of institutions like the WTO, we can see that the future of the WTO is even bleaker than it used to be before all this Liberation Day tariff. But if you are looking at the governance of the industry, we are also seeing that this tariff is shifting the governance of industry to become more located in one country in the US. So with this kind of policy, we can see that countries that have a larger market and a potential to fulfill ability to serve as the value chain, that would benefit more from this sort of policy. But mind you that I don't think that no one country can produce everything within their own country. And that's why ASEAN should be more prepared, in the sense of we have to understand where we stand to benefit more from what we already have. So despite the governance structure being changed toward more the US policy being more mercantilistic, in the sense that they want to just produce and then export to the rest of the world. But there also are the concerns. The US share of manufacturing is not as strong as their share of service. And at the same time, trying to promote rebirth of manufacturing in the US is not going to be that easy. So that remains to be seen. But I think we have seen enough to see that how we now need to prepare to understand our situation and what to do to make sure that we can be resilient in moving forward in the governance that it's less likely to depend on the kind of the global governance that we have seen before.
That's right. Now, of course, you rightly pointed out that rebuilding a manufacturing industry, of course, it's a combination of many different factors and could likely take at least a decade, if not more, as was what's seen in China's example, perhaps, closer to home. But also, Prof Pavida, could these tariffs be seen as a strategic move by America to pivot ASEAN economies away from the deepening trade ties with China? And so how might ASEAN governments use this as leverage to negotiate perhaps more favorable trade terms or diversify political alliances that ultimately lead to trade flows?
I think, many people have seen this tariff as a push for other countries to be closer to China. So I'm not sure that the US would be seeing this as a way to push countries away from China, because China has now become the country that say we want to preserve the system that we have and we are not going to engage in this kind of protectionist trade. So I think that's one thing that we have to be careful about. But I also think that we have seen that this sort of policy is increasing the significance of countries that are not the biggest, but are small and medium size. We are in Asia, we are seeing Japan, Korea discussing more in the role of how they can become the middle power. And we also have Australia and New Zealand in the vicinity of Asia Pacific that are also interested in the kind of the more open regime. And I think that if other countries are strong in being committed to a more open liberation trading environment that we are familiar with, then we can kind of, if the US want to isolate itself into a protectionist wall, then we can leverage ourselves by having other markets on the one hand. But when dealing with the US, I think the strength that ASEAN country has is that we have been the strong base of manufacturing in many strategic industries, automotive and electronics. So yes, the US want to attract many of those back into the US, but at the same time, it will not be possible to do everything. You probably cannot imagine Nike sewing their running shoes in the US again. So how do we use our status quo as something that is beneficial to the US in terms of a very efficient regional value chain that is friendly to the US and also, friendly to others? That could be one way to use ASEAN status quo as leverage in the US shift toward more protectionist policy.
Clearly, and all the data and information coming out from the economic ministers of the ASEAN bloc reacting to the events of the past 2 weeks is pointing towards ASEAN wanting for a rules-based, fair approach to multilateral trade indeed. Prof Pavida, it's been excellent gaining your insights on this, and I'm sure we're going to see much more evolve over the next 90 days. We really appreciate you making time for Niaga Spotlight.
Thank you very much, Tamina.
Well, that's all we have time for today on Niaga Spotlight. I'm Tamina Kowsji signing off for now. And this, of course, today was focusing on US tariffs versus ASEAN centrality, a topic definitely for the rest of 2025. We'll see you again next week with more economic analysis and insights. Here's to a productive week ahead.